today, what we were doing kind of ended up pretty quickly getting into a conversation about what was working and what wasn't working when trying to implement evidence-based practice activities into the classroom. And I started going on about my experiences in trying to implement best bet tables in my psychopathology class. Over a year ago, a number of faculty were identified, Dr. Richardson, myself, Dr. Cohen, to take and put some sort of evidence-based practice element into the classroom so that it continued every semester the students had some activity. And the thing that I had chosen to do as that activity a year ago was the best bets table. And so I want to talk a little bit about my experiences of what was happening with that and kind of the challenges that I was facing with that in working with students. So of course I had the challenge from at the start that I'm teaching psychopathology, and since this is not a psych program, people often find this as being a little bit tangential to their favorite thing about being in practice. But students, in any case, I think they have done a reasonably good job of participating with it. But here are some of the things that I want to talk about that have come up. First and foremost, from the beginning of the semester, I'd say to the students, I gave the students the option that they could either work alone or they could work together, but that they would have to come up with their own topic to do a best bets table on, something that they said that they would have some interest in and put themselves into. So rather than an assigned topic by me, something that they could throw themselves into. The interesting thing that I found was that when I asked them to do that, what they would often do is come up with something very vague and broad. Gee, I'm interested in diet and its effect on depression. They might say, well, okay, and how many tens of thousands of articles might you find on that if you plug that in? You know, and so they would not think of it in terms of a patient. And even though I would talk to them about this and say, well, I want you to do what you really need to do, and the instructions would say, think of a specific patient. And if you're thinking about a broad topic, you've got to start by turning that inside out and thinking, what patient would that be? And I said, make it somebody real. Make it a 23-year-old white female with blah, 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 and go down and write something really specific, and then back off from there. But start with a specific person. Yet the idea of starting with a specific person and a specific patient, to many of the students, was a challenge. That was somehow, when I started a year ago, I thought this would be an easy thing for patients to do. They'd be excited about, or students, they'd be excited about thinking about a patient and applying it. And they were challenged. Most of them were challenged by this idea. And so getting them to work through that and to actually think in terms of a specific patient and working with a specific patient, it's been an ongoing challenge. And part of that is, and one of the real problems becomes, if they're not thinking of a specific patient, they can't possibly be thinking of a PICO question. And so what they would write in terms of their PICO question wasn't really a PICO question, because they didn't set a particular population, because they didn't have a specific patient. And they didn't think in specific terms of what was going to happen to this patient and what this patient needed. And so when we thought about intervention and comparisons and outcomes, particularly outcomes, they didn't think of it in very concrete terms. And so the result was they ended up with something very vague about patients, but more of a student-centered, what I would saw as a student-centered approach of what's a piece of content that I'm interested in, rather than what's a problem that a patient has. And I thought more and more about it, the idea, I think, was that they were caught up in being students and weren't caught up in the idea of being physicians in training. That they could do a student activity, a classroom activity, It was a topic-based activity, but they really struggled with a patient-based activity. And not everyone, the best students would be able to make this adjustment and think in those terms. But many of the students didn't think in terms of being a doctor in training. They didn't think in terms of managing patients or working for patients. They thought in terms of these concepts, these facts.
Kind of doing this with your experience students. A lot of times they don't really know why things are important. And a number of years ago, I'm not saying that this model, the interns, the students in the lower treasury, could try. They came down to me. They had to write a patient plan, how they were going to approach this patient. And yes, exceptional students are always going to do exceptionally well. But my experience was the majority of people had no idea how to approach them.
Yeah. So for everyone, as Dr. Keenan was talking about the fact that we used to rotate students through clinic observations, and we'd ask them to think about writing up a patient plan specific to the patient, and they had really no concept of how to do that and think about the case. Many of the students had difficulty doing that. And we don't have clinic observation in the DP program anymore. I used to use 2 separate courses that students had, and they were rotated through, and that's kind of one of the things that didn't make it through the curriculum revision. So when students didn't write a very good PICO question in my class, what I found, of course, was then their search strategy was lacking. And, students, there were, one of the more common things would happen is that students then would go to write this thing, and here's my search strategy, and they would say, and up pops 1,200 articles, and I selected these 3. And I would say, and how did you select those 3? And the answer usually was, well, those were the first 3 free text articles that were on the list. And I'm going, well, that's not exactly a thoughtful way of evaluating the material itself. And I would say to them, if your search strategy gave you 1,200 articles, you've wasted your time. Because you can't possibly look at 1,200 articles. Then what you need is a better search strategy. And I'm constantly pointing out and trying to promote this idea that, if this is something you're interested in, taking the time to write a good search strategy is really useful, because you can not only use it now and put it in today for this class, but in fact, you can leave it in the system so that it will constantly send articles that fit your specific strategy. And that once you put the strategy in, it lives forever. And the idea that when you're thinking about this patient today that you're working on, it's something that's of interest to you, and if you leave it in there for you to do, for the system, for the computer and the mechanisms to work for you constantly, to pop up those articles that show up along the line that fit your specific search strategy, so that the next time a patient with this condition walks in your office, you're still up to date without having to do another search. And so it's a one-time activity that lasts you through your whole professional career. And they think about that and they go, oh. And I said, remember when they talked about that in your EDP class, and they're like, oh, yeah, okay. But then they're right back to being students again, and let's just get through the semester, and I can't think about the long term. So one of the things I think happens is that it's difficult for them to think about long term, what this means, not just long term, the broad term of thinking about patients rather than being students, but thinking long term about gathering material as they go along. They compartmentalize everything into their classes and getting through the exams and all of that. So search strategies are fun to look at in how broadly, how broadly scoped they are. And actually, once they get to the articles, and whatever articles they pick, they actually do a pretty good job then of breaking down the articles and the information that's there. They know how to, if you hand them something, if they've got something in front of them, what are the steps I need to do to analyze whether this is any good or helpful or not. That's always been the easiest part for the students. But that's kind of the factoid part of what you're doing, that analysis. But then they come back, and because they didn't really set a specific patient, they didn't really do that great a job on the FICO question, when it comes to application at the end and trying to decide, so what am I going to do with this patient, and how am I going to proceed, and what are the issues that I've uncovered and resolved in terms of managing this patient, again, they fall down in terms of being able to think that through and make something of it. And so it's almost like they extract out, okay, I can analyze these articles. So it's almost like my job is to find 3 articles and then analyze it, rather than be a doctor and make a difference. And so I'm always trying to talk to them about this idea, be a doctor, make a difference. And that is, again, I've been doing this for a year, and that still is the struggle that I have in terms of working with this in the classroom, is how do you make that real rather than this single activity. I think we're all faced with that, not just in terms of PPP in our class, but with all the content in our classes, of trying to get them to not just think of it as a class, and as something more. I guess I want to tell an anecdote here. A number of years ago when Dr. Cohen was a clinician in the clinic, student came in after having met with the patient and kind of worked the patient up, and Dr. Cohen asked him a question about the patient and that patient's experience of their illness and how they were experiencing their illness based on something that I was talking about, that I would always talk about in my doctor-patient class. Because he was aware of, we had talked, he was aware of this piece of material, and the student looked at him and said, I never learned about that. And Dr. Cohen said, oh, yes, you did. In Dr. Shiel's class, that, we talked about this and that, the other thing. The student thought for a minute and said, oh, well, but that was just a class. And Dr. Cohen was like, well, no. It's more than that. You have to do something with these things. Like all the stuff you have to do something with. And we're still, I think, that's kind of an ongoing struggle over all the years that I've been here. How do we help students make that transition from student to physician in training? And EVP, I think, is a huge opportunity to do that. But students, because of what they bring, what they brought from, their expectations from other places and the other academics they've been through, they don't always make that transition so easily. So just in putting that together, that's the first thing I wanted to mention. Those are some of the things that I experienced, you probably have experienced and will experience in working with these things. And it can be frustrating, but it's also informative and interesting in terms of where they go. So the issue really becomes for me, how do you motivate students to produce the high quality work that we're after? How do you get them to make that transition to being physician in training? Making a connection between classroom and practice. One of the things I've run across in the last year is some research that's gone on this idea, talking about facilitating students' personal values as a way of getting them, in fact, more involved and personally connected to what's happening. This research started when they were looking at grade school and high school performance. And they found that if they asked students to, and this was in, I think the first study was a high school study. But they asked students to sit down and write about their personal attributes and abilities, and how they might, and why and how those were important to them. Not about application or anything else, but to just kind of soul search a little bit and talk about what they had to offer. And they found that doing that activity actually gave some crazy thing like a 40% boost in performance by lower performing students. Now, the high performing students, it didn't really help at all, but the lower performing students, it made all the difference in terms of how they performed. Much, and when you think about all the research out there in education, when you get a 2% or 3% bump, that's like a big deal. They got a 40% bump by doing this one activity once at the beginning of the semester. And when they first did it, the researchers said, this is an anomaly, this can't be true, this can't be right. And they went back and have replicated it many times in different spots. A number of years ago, back in 2003, I took a year's leave of absence to go work for the Gates Foundation grant in education. One of the things I found that there was a person who's a good friend of mine who was running some alternative schools, and he would only take students. He only got students from the education system in Milwaukee, students that had flunked out of the Milwaukee public school system. So he was an alternative school that only got the students that had failed. And so students would be sent to him in his schools kind of his way. He was graduating students at better than a 90% rate and sending them off to college at better than a 90% rate. And one of the things he did when students would show up, and he got in trouble with the school district for doing this, because the school district would send students to him, and he would say, they can't be automatically enrolled in my school. They need to go through an intake interview. And the intake interview had one question in it. It was, when the student showed up, he said to the student, do you want to be here? And if the student said yes, they'd say, you're in. And if they said no, they'd say, well, then don't come. This is not the place for you if you don't want to be here. That was his one intake question. And when I think about this research that's come out in the last year, he's doing the same thing. He's saying, asking students to talk about their personal values here and have some sense of agency in terms of what's going on. That's what the research is saying, that the student has some sense of agency of it being connected to them and them having some control and ability to succeed. That it makes all the difference. And so the issue that's come up and I've been trying to struggle with over this last year is how do you create this sense of agency in students who you would think, because they've applied to come here, selected to come here, and done all these things, made all these decisions, would have that sense of agency. Yet what we find is the students don't. They are students feeling out of control and going through the system and doing what they're told and getting by and not having that internal locus of control or a sense of that internal sense of values. So what the recent things have been saying is that when you take this idea, when you take students to and ask them to do this kind of personal value thing, that it can make a huge difference. So this research just came out in September. And so my plan is to next semester, this semester, to on Tuesday, my first day of class, give them a writing assignment to talk about their personal values. And in fact, in the research, they spent 15 minutes asking students to write on their personal values. And so the idea would be that their personal values about becoming a physician. And I'm going to see what effect that has on their sense of agency in the way that they perform then in terms of these tasks in the classroom.
You're not going to ask them the question, do you want to be here?
I could ask them that question. I think I do think it's an important one. And when I'm advising students all the time, I try to get around to that question, and get them to, not in an accusatory way, but in a way of getting them to say, this is what I want to do. And then, say, well, we can map a course for you to do that. You can do this. You can use your skills in your specific way, use your strengths to succeed here. And make it, and recognize that they need to become a physician based on their skills and abilities. So yeah, what I don't want to ask them is, do you want to be here in my class? You're going to get the wrong answer. When I work as doing family therapy, one of the things I always would tell people would come in with problems with their children. I said, if you want obedient children, never tell them to do something they're not already doing. And so there's the wrong gift question is always a bad question. Do you want to be here in class? Kind of like saying, do you want to go to school today? For a little one, they're going to say no, and you don't want to ask that. So the idea is, for all of the content we can put in and all the specifics we can put into the information that's out there, we're still faced with the task of how do we help students make that transition to have it being that kind of self-motivation and participation, a sense of confidence in their values being connected to being here. Again, because the research is saying if we ask them to think about their values, that it makes a difference. Now, here's one interesting thing about the research stuff, is that if you tell them we're going to do a writing assignment that's going to help you increase your sense of connection to this course so you can take more initiative, blah, 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 and talk about what you're doing, the effect disappears. The point is that when you objectify it and make it something that you're doing to the students to get them to participate, you take away that internal sense of control and you make it a manipulation. And so the research is saying you can't turn it into that issue. You've got to give them an opportunity to think about these things and lead them to it, not make it be something that, as a technique to drag them where they're going. So that's really kind of fascinating. So I'm thinking about how do I do that? How do I get this in? I've got some leeway as being a psychologist, because I'm a psychologist, no thank you, I'm a psychologist. But to make that transition, to get them to think about themselves and who they are, affects the way then they approach what they do. And I think it's one of the things students are actually hoping for. I know students often get caught up in thinking, well, I'm going through all these classes, and then I'll get to clinic, and I'll be able to start learning how to be a doctor. I mean, how many times have we heard students say that? And we know a lot of times that they're thinking that even when they're not saying it by their behaviors. And then they get that rude awakening that you can't start learning to be a doc when you're in front of patients. It's a little late in the game. So helping them make that transition, I think, is important. So I'm kind of trying to work through all these things, and whether it's for an activity like this inside a class in the core curriculum, or whether we're trying to develop an elective class. The danger is still, I'll take this elective class and I'll do the work to get through the class and get the grades. Even though they say, well, they get to choose, right? We got to choose coming here. We got to choose a lot of things. But oftentimes, with electives, again, because the way our electives set up, is they're choosing the lesser of evils. Well, I'll take this class because it's on Tuesdays at 7 o'clock, and that's a good time for me. And that's how oftentimes that's how students will choose an elective. Not because, boy, this is really exciting and interesting, I'm going to throw myself into it. Sometimes we get that, but the majority are based on are kind of these softer factors of the right day, the right time, maybe something broadly the right topic, something that they find is going to be easy, or maybe they think it's going to be not too difficult, maybe interesting, we hope. And so getting them to get that investment, I think, is kind of interesting. I'd like to open up to some of your experiences and thoughts about when you've worked with these issues.
Dan? My question is about asking the students about their values. Could you give me an example of a value that the student might identify in themselves that would make them do a better job?
The question I'm going to ask, I have formulated it all the ways, and I was thinking about this over the break about how to do this. And I have till Tuesday to decide. Dr. Childs knows that, right? A deadline is the day you put on. You don't decide until the deadline is there. That's part of my personality profile. My plan is to ask the students something like, what personal attributes will you bring to your patients that you think will make a difference in care?
What do you think you'll get as a response?
I don't know what I'm going to get. And what's interesting is the research says it doesn't really matter
that's
what they come up with. I mean, I'm hoping we don't get personal attributes. My personal attribute is I really want to make a lot of money, and I'll be good because I want to make money, and I don't know. But
just the fact that they
think of it, the fact that they're
will
thinking
make them do better.
Yes, the fact that they're thinking about it, that they are now you're creating this kind of personal space, but also a sense of personal agency. They think, this is me, this is what I have to offer.
I guess I don't know what agency means.
A sense of control.
Oh.
That they have something to bring to the table, something to offer.
The fact is really that we gave them the opportunity to have some ownership. We're just giving them an opportunity to take a little bit of ownership of their own thought process. That's what you're doing.
Yeah, and giving them a sense that they can accomplish something. Yeah. That they actually have personal attributes that will help them impress.
Okay, thank you.
It gives them kind of a so I don't want everybody to come and do this in their class, though.
Well, why
not?
One thing that I noticed is from the flip side, sitting there lecturing to people, is one thing, but actually having them try to apply, I find that some of them will end up projecting the fact that they're not getting stuff, done or applying it to not the fact of how they've been taught. They project it back onto you that it's the clinician's fault that I'm not getting, or the teacher's fault that I'm not getting.
Yes.
So, and I don't know if it's just systems of people, because it's not every single class, but, they have kind of like that sense of, the blame is not on me, the blame is on you. I don't know this because they're not teaching it right to me.
Yeah, that is interesting. It happens so.
How do you guys keep on doing this to me? But that's the thing with, all this is great, but, when you end up with a lot of the kids that we're getting now, and I say that as kids because, really, they have no clue what they're going to end up getting when they're actually out there in practice. And it's the one thing that I try to hammer into them. But as soon as I sit there and I try to get them to have accountability for what they're doing, or bring that up, I swear to God, I feel like it's a baby running back to mommy. It just,
Yeah, I have a suggestion. When I started my job, I went through the fact that after 2 classes, was the new role. When I came here with a set way of teaching, a set way of what I wanted to do, and really quickly I realized it's not going to work. I had to give some freedom to them. And having worked with Dr. Stonsberg, I watched when he taught his residents, and he would just stare a hole right in the temple, break them down to clinical levels, and build them back up. and almost traumatized. But they were, and that's what they wanted. And I asked the interns, what kind of learning works with you? Do you want to be spoon-fed in the beginning, or do you want me to put you in a corner and keep asking until you have an answer? And they actually enjoyed that. They'll tell you what they want. And they all learn differently.
Yes, they all learn differently.
And some will try versus some get bored with me just spoon-feeding it. Sometimes I'm frustrated with them.
One of the things interesting relative to that, we talked about that a number of years ago, Dr. Downs will remember this, we were doing our exit interviews. We were getting students coming out of the clinic, and some were saying, boy, this was the greatest experience of my life, the clinician was wonderful, it taught me all sorts of things, it was always there, it always had all these questions, and on about how wonderful the clinician was. And sometimes we would tell them this was a terrible experience, I didn't learn anything, waste of time, blah, blah, blah. And they sometimes used to be about the same clinician in the same semester. So one of the things we did is we started giving Myers-Briggs tests to all the students and the faculty, and found that, sure enough, if the personality profile of the student was the same as the doctor, they had glowing things to say about it. And if it was an opposite person, and then it shifted down to okay, normal stuff or nothing to say, but if you had an opposite personality type, this was the worst experience ever that they had. So the original thought was we were going to match students with personality types. And we found out at that time, every clinician we had was an ESTJ. An STJ at least. And so if you didn't have the STJ letters after your name, you were out of luck as a student. So instead what we did is we did a little education program for the clinicians back then. We said, these Myers-Briggs types, and here's what you are, and there are these weird people on the other side. Myself being one of them, I'm an INFP. Yeah, we did on the question. Yeah, they were all STJs. Yeah, and which is in fact the most predominant group out there in the population. And when I first took the test, and I found myself to be this INFP, there's the minority of the minority of the minority of the minority, the smallest group out there. I realized it's not everybody else; it is me. But there are those, there are those differences in students. So you're right. Every student is different, and you got to find a way to.
You ask them when they first get clinic, and try your hardest, because some of them want you to do their first history, and it makes a huge difference just having watched one done once.
Yes.
Versus others are so frustrated with them in the room seeing me with patients because it's putting them in a smaller position, and they never seem to pick their confidence up from that. And that is just a suggestion that sometimes it really can make a difference because you can find really quickly, I don't know what letters it is, but those eyeballs come my way and it makes a huge difference.
Exactly. So the idea is there again is how do you give them the sense of participation and which is part of the reason why when it comes to like the topic in my class, what are you interested in? What topic do you want to write about in terms of the best pet statement? What are you going to do? And I said, as long as it broadly touches on this class, and I'm not so specific. Sometimes they'll stretch things, and but generally they make a connection, and it's like I want them to have that personal involvement.
How are you going to measure if it makes a difference?
Am I going to measure if it makes a difference? Well, what I'm hoping is just I don't have a scientific way, but I'm just going to look and see how the test tables turn out, whether they do, whether I see a higher level of better PICO questions and more specific searches, and I've been really diligent, of course. I would have gone to the research department and how do I collect this data? How are you going to publish it?
Well, what's the hypothesized mechanism behind that effect? Why do you think that occurred?
Good question.
Well, the suggestion is that because you're raising, again, that sense of agency, the person, in fact, becomes, by doing things that increase the person's sense of being a player, or getting them to notice or think about themselves as having some central role or initiative or ability to succeed. In the research, they're saying that in doing this task, it increases their sense of belonging and their sense that they can actually succeed at what they're doing. And with an increased sense of them being able to succeed, then they're able to throw themselves more into the task. That they're more participatory. So seeing themselves as being able to succeed with it, they're saying is kind of the key element. That if you don't know where you're going or what you're going to do or whether you're going to succeed or not, that's one of the reasons you let kind of everyone else kind of direct where it's going. So the idea of the research they're saying is that because it increases that sense of you being able to succeed and having some control over what happens.
I was going to say that I read one where it was ability to succeed in taking a test, and they did a similar thing of writing before taking the test. And what the students reported is it gave them a sense that somebody kind of cared about this, even though they weren't told that anybody was going to read what they wrote. And in fact, they weren't even asked to turn it in. But at the time, it gave them a sense of community, of being involved in a community, and that somebody was interested in them. And then it led them into a feeling of being more in control of the situation. They weren't told what they had to write or anything like that, but it was just that developing the community, which gave a sense of control, and the students did better on the test. And when they did a little profile of anxiety, these were students that were affected by test anxiety, and their anxiety levels were way down because they felt that they had more control and a greater sense they were on playing in part of the community. And that was the two things that made the psychological difference, because right before the test, they're just as prepared as any.
How much right before the test? I mean,
this
just
was,
like right
this
before
was
the
immediately
test.
before the test. 15 to 20 minutes before the test, they were asked to write. They were given, just write a little bit about this or anything you feel like.
And did they turn it in, or did they just keep it on their desk?
They were not asked to turn it in. They could turn it in at the end if they wanted. Yeah, to just see what topics people wrote about. But it wasn't even. There wasn't really anything consistent, among people.
Right.
What they wrote about. But just being able to write about something that matters to them or what their thoughts were gave them those two aspects, and they did better.
Significant.
Yeah.
Was that the one where they were asked to address their anxiety? Because there's a study that was pretty recent where the students were simply same model, but they were simply asked express any anxiety you have about this test you're about to take, and the results again was they scored results on the test which were significantly improved when the students simply went through that exercise without any feedback to them, based upon if they did write anything that they wrote.
Yeah, yeah.
So something about self-expression.
Yeah, so self-expression matters in terms of being able to participate, perform, and have a sense of being able to perform.
So with our curriculum of 23 to 29 credits, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., there's never a break, fire hose volume of information. Where's the opportunity to allow our students to self-express?
This is not exactly on that topic, but one thing I've done the last couple of semesters in my psychopathology class, I give in-class quizzes. So one of the things I've done the last few semesters is I will give a quiz, and students will work on the quiz, and then I'll say, all right, you have 5 minutes now to discuss your answers with everyone else in the room, anyone else in the room, and adjust your answers accordingly based on your conversations with other people before you turn it in. They all look at me like, I can't believe it has actually happened because I know the score of this quiz. Yeah, but you can fix it. You know, no, that's right. Somebody else got a better idea. I don't.
Email it? Like when my daughter entered high school, her teacher emailed me, please tell me about your child's strengths or sensitivities. And I took an evening and did it and emailed it to her. I don't know if they ever read it, if she ever did anything with it. But I felt really empowered as a parent that I even sat and did it. Maybe they could email it to you guys.
It's, and the problem is they're overwhelmed at the beginning, and I've you know, my world is currently now I interview and meet with and talk to every single student who fails to meet minimal academic standards in their first trimester. So I hear a lot. And what we say to them as they're coming in, what's going to happen tomorrow in the orientation for the class coming in, pretty much meaningless. And student after student is telling me this. And then first trimester instructors talk to them. Meaningless. There's no connection. Doesn't connect. You know, we're communicating, but this is happening more and more. We're communicating in ways that are meaningful to us. We're not connecting with our students, or our students are not connecting to us. Now, going, you know, to what you're saying, I think I get the sense we have an increasing proportion of students who've they've gone through all the hoops. They're committing themselves to an unbelievable financial commitment to come here, and they don't know why. They have their sense of why they're here is pretty vague. And when they get hit with the challenge, the workload that we require, it's falling them over. They don't know how to deal with that. But they don't really know why they're here to the extent that that's going to give them the internal support they need to meet the incredible work demands that we place on them, that we're going to start placing on these students next Monday. So, you know, we talk about critical thinking, critical learning, evidence-based learning. We're talking at a level way up here where, in all honesty, our students are coming in, and the most common statement that I hear from students now who fail to achieve a 2.0 grade point in their first trimester is, I don't know what to do. I was great as an undergraduate student. I've always done good. I've never been in this situation, and I don't know what to do. That is the most common scenario that I'm encountering. I'm talking at least 1/3 of the students coming in now. And then if you could get to the point of saying, well, what's your motivation? You know, well, I want to be here. Well, why? Well, you know, because this is what I want to do. So while we say, let's bring all of this into our curriculum, I believe we have some fundamental issues with a growing percentage of students who are coming into the program that they're not ready to do critical thinking. They're not ready to do evidence-based, you know, it's what you're saying, to be thinking like a physician in training, but they don't know what that means. They don't even know what it means to be a physician. Their notion is pretty vague. You know, that's just a sense. I don't know. But.
Well, what's interesting, I think, about this is one thing I think is interesting about all this is the idea that instead of we're not asking a why question, why do you want to be here? We're asking kind of a what question. What characteristics do you have? Who are you? You know, what can you tell us about yourself? It goes back to your comment about when they ask you to write about, you know, teachers ask you to write about what is your kid like? You know? That it's not something that you have to explain or whatever. You're talking about yourself. You're kind of opening up who you are, not what you're supposed to be. You're supposed to become, and creating a little bit of ground of kind of a centering place to be able to, you know, here's who I am. Here's what here's how I see myself in some way.
It's just that's hard to do under the pressure of our curricular design. As I tell students, there's another course they're taking, but they're not paying for it, and they're not getting credit for it. You know, they all stare at it. Well, it's learning how to learn, and just a little bit more fundamentally, I think it is what you're addressing. Learning about yourself to the extent that's going to be necessary to enable you to get onto this treadmill that we have, that they're going to have to go through to become the physician in training that you're discussing.
Right. So, you know, the goal, I think, is that when we're trying to, as I was thinking about this, when we're trying to put these EVP things into our classes or in electives or anything else, what we don't want to be saying to students is, all right, here's another hoop to jump through. Here's just another activity, another burdensome thing that you have to do. That if students view it as just another burden, another hoop, just another way of making their life more difficult, then we're not going to have the desired results. What we want is students to be taking the time. I mean, just, you know, on the other side of the coin, you know, it's like last semester I'm teaching class, and I mentioned to the students about, we talk about one particular area, and I said, you know, I'm talking about what the recent research is in, and I said, well, I haven't really looked here in about 6 months, so how do you know, you might want to go look and see if there's anything new in this area. And then I went home that night, I thought, yeah, I haven't looked in 6 months, and I went home, and over the weekend, I looked it up, and on Monday when I went back to class, I said, well, I took my own advice. And actually, I had been, the weekend I had been visiting my daughter, and like late one night, Saturday night after everyone was in bed, I got on the computer and kind of looked some of this stuff up. And so I said to them, so over the weekend when I was, you know, visiting my grandchildren, I looked this up and they all laughed like, oh man, what a geek. He actually spent his weekend and instead of doing something fun, was looking this stuff up. And I'm thinking, yeah, this is really fun. But I said, oh yeah, that's not really like but we want them to have that kind of enthusiasm on it. Isn't this interesting? You know, what could I find here? What's this going to, you know, what is this going to mean? What could happen? And of course, I know once you've been out there and you've been in practice, whenever you run across any piece of material, you can apply it to dozens of patients that you've had in the past, and you know that it's going to come up down the road. So we have that easy application. Our students very often don't have that easy application. They don't see it in that sense. They're still, like I said, in that student mode. But we do want them to have, you know, hopefully they get this idea. We want to get them that some sense. That's the challenge, I think. Some sense that this is really entertaining and interesting and fun and useful and make the difference in terms of how they'll be adopted. And that, I think, is the challenge that we face, is how do we bring ourselves there rather than, oh, here's just another hoop to jump through, more problems, more papers, more things. Did you actually do that in class? How many more things do we have to do? Why do we have to write this or do this? You know, of course, like last semester, we had students going, why do I have to come to class? Because now we've got our mandatory attendance. And I've seen a number of emails that have come forward. Why do I have to go? I can't waste my time going to class. I've got all these notes to read. I can learn much better at home. So, you think, oh, you know. So, anyway, helping students make that transition is the difficult thing, and if we're to be successful, I think, with this project, we have to be successful in that broader sense of bringing that stuff home to our students.
I think we have a couple of major ways that can be accomplished, but they're not easy. If you look at the PT profession, they require approximately 300 hours of shadowing someone in PT before they can get into school. May create part of that personal value thing. Is this really what I want to do? And an understanding of what it is, how many hours it is and how you have to do that. If we also connect that to the actual learning and how our brain functions in taking in new material, it has to be connected to some personal experience. Now you have a personal experience as well. Whether or not we want to go that far, I don't know. But a very direct thing that's happened in our massage program with the introduction to massage course is our rate of people even getting D's in courses has diminished greatly because the ones who want to be there and spend the time and practice and do what they need to do during that 16 hours in order to get into the program are the ones that really want to do it. And if they don't or they can't, they're not here. So there's a couple of ways to make that work, probably both with values and with learning.
Like I said, I know that I'm familiar with Florida University of Wisconsin has just opened a PharmD program, and in their first semester, in the middle of the semester, they stop and they take 2 weeks out, and they send everybody off to 1 week in a box pharmacy and 1 week in a hospital setting, working as pharmacists and shadowing people. And the experience they had was that after those 2 weeks, they find there's a good percentage of students going, I don't know why I came here, I'm out of here.
It's bad for retention.
It's bad for retention, although what they find is that that most of the people go, yeah, this is really great, and now they have something to hang what they're learning in, something stronger to hang what they're learning in. And I think that's what you're getting. I mean, how do they have, what are the hooks to hang it on?
As the Department of Ed requires gainful employment, as they are right now from anything that's a certificate program, and probably will very shortly in the professions, you need to make sure you can meet the numbers, or your program is not going to work. So it may be something that needs to be considered in the short term as well.
Yeah. I've run over. So why don't we stop it there and turn on the pictures. Thanks for your time.